So what brings us here today? For more than 1.5 years, we have been seeing a huge refugee movement from Ukraine. Since the Russian invasion started, millions of people left behind their homes, their communities, and their way of life, and sought refuge all around Europe. In response to these tragic events that uprooted so many, we saw change-making blossom at an astonishing rate. Local communities, migrant leaders, social entrepreneurs, businesses, all of them quickly jumped into action. And today we are here to celebrate the incredible work that all of those that stepped up to welcome and support people on the move, while also recognizing change-making in migrants themselves. And we want to today inspire you by their leaders, but also challenge as we look ahead and envision the future for Europe for all. And before I pass the word to my colleague Misza, allow me to thank all the involved Ashoka teams and all the communities that were part of this huge map in Czech Republic, Germany, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And they came together to map 365 leaders in migration, learn with them, understand their challenges, emerging opportunities and narratives surrounding migration. And together with my team, we captured it all in the report that we are launching here today. And with that, I will pass the mic to my colleague, Misza. Misza, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ella. It's a great pleasure to bring this project and this product of the work of so many people in our team of teams to your attention. And I'll start sharing my screen now. So as Ella mentioned, thousands of people, dozens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people stepped up all over Europe to welcome Ukrainian refugees. And that inspired us to give the title to our report, Stepping Up. But not only because they have already stepped up and jumped in, or any other expressions you can use, and they rose to the occasion, but also because we, as everyone around them, as the ecosystem in which they operate, have also to step up. And this is what our report is about. So I'll briefly go through the profile of those change makers that we mapped, and we will touch upon such topics as self-perception of themselves, of these change makers, then the barriers and opportunities they see, the shifting of the mindsets that they would like to happen in Europe, and the recommendations that Ashoka is making will come later today as well. So first of all, we're using this expression change makers, and change makers is an expression that can have many definitions, but for the purpose of this research, we consider change maker as a person who takes creative action to solve a social problem, a person who has the will and the skills to make a positive change, and someone who puts empathy in action for the good of all. It's a definition we operated upon, and through this criteria we managed to reach 365 change makers. They were interviewed through a process of in-depth conversations that lasted around an hour with each person. We used snowball methodology, meaning that in the 6 countries that were involved, we started with initial cohorts that were selected by Ashoka staff with a diversity of backgrounds, geographies, identities, and sectors in mind. And those people then nominated the next and the next and the next and the next. And so we arrived at 365 change makers interviewed, which is, of course, not the whole community of change makers working on making the lives of Ukrainian refugees in Europe better. But this is a very strong cohort representing their mindset, their views, and their work. A short word on geography, why we selected those 6 countries that you see on the screen now. First of all, because 4 of them neighbor with Ukraine directly. That's Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And additionally, we took in Czechia and Germany because those are the countries that, along with Poland, welcomed the highest number of refugees over this 1.5 years. And just also another piece of data in terms of geography, and you see I'm wearing a white coat almost as if I were a lab scientist, so you know I like data. The idea is that the finding is that 3/4 of those change makers live in big cities. Now a little bit more about their profile. Of course, one interesting characteristic is gender, and what we observed in this research is that gender is still strongly influenced by the traditional frameworks. Tradition assigns the roles. Even though 70% of our change makers are women, and we can say that something traditional, that that help has a female face, right? Nevertheless, it's still quite traditional what women are involved with. They're involved in sectors such as healthcare and education, while men, who are less than 30% of this cohort, they are more involved in coordination, meaning facilitating cooperation between different actors in the sector, and they're more involved in funding. And while they are a smaller percentage, much smaller than women, less than half of what women are, they take more leadership positions. 7% more of our male respondents are key leaders in the organizations than women. At the same time, men are conscious of the, let's call it, social conditioning of their situation. And they, for example, they express the desire, a lot of them express the desire to increase direct contact with migrants. And women, at the same time, are more sensitive to such issues as mental health and economic disparities, for example, between different migrant communities, like the refugees from the previous wave and Ukrainian refugees, or between the local disadvantaged communities and the refugees.
Und den Kontakt in den lokalen Gemeinschaften vor Ort.
Migrantes con respecto a las comunidades locales y las
більше мають такий зв'язок з тими мігрантами, з якими вони працюють.
System benutzt,
say that women are more connected than men. In terms of the age, which was a special focal point of attention for Germany and Poland, but we had young change makers as part of this cohort in all countries. Young people below 25, they're only 12% of our group. They occupy lower positions. 1/5 of them are 20% less leaders. They're less connected, less access to funding. They quite often have to operate individually or without a formal organization because it's harder for them to fund one. At the same time, they show extremely high level of self-perception, the very same level of self-perception and self-identification as a person who can change the world as the adults, the same level of confidence. Interestingly, they are not just trying to build a better world, but they already feel like they live in one. They don't focus on so much as reinventing systems, but they already live in them. They're more optimistic about the system's readiness. They focus on problem solving. In these sectors that require less resources, they already bring in their full capacity and they can take the lead in those sectors. They show more involvement in the sectors, in some sectors than the adults, for example, in such sectors as such areas of help as translations, narratives, working with prejudice, many other topics where the young people don't need the existing funding or pre-existing logistical base and such other things that are inaccessible to them. But at the same time, young people create a new climate. They involve youth and refugees much more in their work. So if a young person is a leader of an organization, they tend to involve in their organization much more the young people and the refugees themselves. And finally, and I think it's very important for our conversation, is the percentage of migrants and refugees who themselves joined the work on welcoming other refugees. It's 1/3 of our respondents were with migration background. 8% of this cohort of 365, 28 people, are themselves refugees who arrived from Ukraine last year. And again, they are less connected, less, their start is difficult. They operate informally or unofficially. Not so many of them are leaders. They have less funding, but at the same time, they're very much focused on the community, on their own peers from the migrant community. They offer support, they build networks, psychological help. They're very aware of such barriers as misinformation, language and historical barriers, discrimination and racism. And again, as another disadvantaged group, they give much more space to the youth and to other migrants and refugees. So they again create a new quality of work. Now, speaking about work, just a few snippets of what these changemakers are involved with. 70% of them operate through NGOs, and the next big group are individuals or informal groups, followed by public sector and a tiny little bit from the private sector. around 75% are 74% actually are key leaders in their organizations, and the rest are supporters. They take the lead. In terms of when the organizations were started, 80% started before the war and then either shifted their attention or broadened the scope of their responsibility, and only 1/5, 20%, were started in response to the war. And then around 70% again work with wider society than just the migrants and refugees, and they try to make Europe a better place for all, as the title of our report says. A few words about the roles these organizations or initiatives are taking upon themselves. Obviously, a huge majority, 84%, are involved in hands-on work, in implementing projects, in direct help. Over 40% are involved in coordination, so again, facilitating cooperation between different actors in the field. Around 20 are involved in funding and a little bit less in research. And the fifth role is regulation, so public sector involved in streamlining the interactions within the ecosystem. These are the areas of help. These are the types of work that these initiatives are taking upon themselves, and I'll give you a minute to read through those yourselves, or you can find it in the report as well. It's interesting that half are involved in education and support networks, and the rest are following. The following areas of work are also quite important. But what is alarming, and we will speak about that in the area of recommendations, is that those types of work, those areas of help that are the least immediate and the most long-term, so for example, policies, preventing violence, and narratives work, are the least taken, the least cared by, because there is so much direct need of direct, immediate help and hands-on involvement. And that is one of the big findings for us in this report. Now, in terms of funding, which is an important factor as well, we must praise our changemakers. They're all very entrepreneurial and creative. On average, every changemaker from this report gets funding from almost 3 different types of sources of funding. So mixing the state support and private support and other sources. As you can see, the most popular source of funding are the private donations and crowdfunding, meaning it's us, everyone in Europe, the population is actually stepping in to support those organizations. Public money comes much later on in this ladder. Interestingly, the EU sector for EU funding is rather low, but alarmingly, there's also a group of organizations that operate on no funding. They haven't managed, or they've found ways to operate with no funding. Now, a few things about the findings. So one important area is the self-perception. Why are we talking about self-perception? We have observed as Ashoka in the previous many years of work that those people who self-identify as changemakers, so who have this level of intentionality in what they're doing and not just saying, oh, I got accidentally involved, I was passing by something. Those who are self-identifying as changemakers are more likely to continue their work and to inspire others to discover their power. So it's about the long-term vision, and it's also about activating others. And we measured this by asking a direct question to the respondents how strongly they identify as changemakers, and their level across all groups is approximately 85%, which is very high. We see that there are slight differences. We see that those who've had to overcome hardships, for example, who see that the systems were not ready when they arrived in Europe, or that they have it harder to found an initiative, it boosts their self-perception. Also, we see that there are existing power structures that take the self-perception lower. Some identity, some geographies have an impact. Some sectors differences. Public and NGOs are stronger than private, than business. We see that those types of help that require a certain level of intentionality, as we said, so the deradicalization, narrative, diversity types of help, they actually are connected, correlate to higher levels of self-perception. And alarmingly, the group that was showing the lowest level of self-perception as a changemakers was actually the group that reported having no funding, and that is very sad. One golden snippet of knowledge that we extracted from this, golden nugget of knowledge that we extracted from this research is that if you are a non-migrant in your society and you work in an initiative that is strongly run by migrants and refugees, on average, your self-perception is 10% higher than your other non-migrant fellows who are operating in a very local initiative. So what that shows to us is that if we if the societies, if the ecosystem makes more space for migrants and refugees to lead, this very strongly reflects on the activation of local population, of the hosting communities. And that is a very important factor for us, meaning showing how much involvement we should work on from the migrants and refugees. And this I can just illustrate with an example of one of our changemakers from Poland. She's actually from Ukraine, Elizaveta Nahorna, from the Foundation Ukraine. It's one of the most active and youth-led organizations in Poland, offering integration support and many other services. And the organization that grew threefold since last year. And Elizaveta mentions that she started her journey at this foundation with volunteering. So she knows how important it is for NGOs to create a space to work with active people, to give them agency. And this, for us, is another way of speaking of this level of self-awareness and self-perception as changemakers. Now, of course, these changemakers speak of barriers that they see on the way of implementing their help. Of course, the strongest is lack of funding. There's not enough money for their work. But at the same time, they speak of the role of authorities, meaning that sometimes instead of being a helpful partner, the authorities are actually a hindrance or another dragon to slay. And the next is mental health challenges, workforce issues, so lack of not enough workers, lack of awareness in the society, and prejudices. And these can be grouped into 3 levels, but I'll skip this for now as we want to hear more from the changemakers themselves. So our changemaker from Slovakia, Ivona, is saying that there's a missing integration strategy plan for foreigners. So the very short-sightedness from the local authorities. Irina from Romania mentions that migrants and refugees do not take anything from Romanians, but are opportunity for systemic changes. And that's very important, the perception of the public. We asked the changemakers about their other opportunities they see in the field. They mentioned such things as strong community to work with, meaning both the Ukrainian refugees and other changemakers. They mentioned sense of urgency, so they spoke of the urgent need to get engaged in the field. Untapped future potential, both again of the Ukrainian refugees and of the community that helps them. General goodwill of society, which might come as a surprise, along with another surprising factor, positive narratives that exist in society. Here we can quote Stefanie Landa from Germany, from the Sisters Network that supports young women. We must prioritize the creation of spaces that foster personal connections between diverse individuals. These environments will facilitate open and honest dialogue and offer opportunities to learn how to navigate and resolve conflicts constructively. And the last bit I will focus on today is shifting mindset and values. So we asked our changemakers as to what has to change in the mentality of societies in Europe in order for the migrants and refugees to be seen as a positive force for the society. And they mentioned several things. First of all, they mentioned that the society needs to learn more about empathy and practice it more in general. It is connected to overcoming biases, so working with stereotypes and prejudices is important. Thirdly, recognizing migrants' contributions, so seeing migrants as bringing value to the economy, to the culture, to the social fabric in this country. Fourth, connected to the previous one, is addressing the fear of loss. So quite a few people are believing that migrants are taking something away and we are being neglected because of the support for the migrants, and it's important to show that this is actually a win-win situation. Next important topic is promoting mental health, because it is a challenging area both for the newcomers but also for the host community. Next is challenging our identity, meaning that we have to reimagine what it means to be a Slovak person, a Romanian. We have to look back at the history of our nations to see that we are actually much more a nation of migrants in the past than we used to think, for example. Another mindset shift is increasing the role of communities, mentioned by the Changemakers, meaning that the focus has to be not just on satisfying the needs of the individuals, but how this affects, how this reshapes, how this affects the fluidity of the communities around. And last but not least, it is important to celebrate the efforts. So not just pay attention to the challenges and the difficulties, but also make it celebrated and known how much good work has been done here. And here I will quote two changemakers, one from Hungary, Zuzsa, and Petr from Czechia. Zuzsa says, own experiences enforce positive narratives and reflections on the family level and community level inclusion. And Petr speaks of the broad spectrum of actors that should be involved in building narratives. There are many who can tell positive stories. Even migrants themselves are still objects of debate rather than empowered individuals defending their rights. And this is something that we care very much here with this report. And I will close my presentation at this moment. The link to the report will be now posted, or probably already posted in the chat by Ovi. Please check the report out. It's available online in English, German, and Ukrainian, and more languages will follow. Please drop your questions in the chat. We will unpack them in the Q&A section of today's presentation. And now I am inviting Kenny Clewett, co-leader of Hello World, to facilitate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Misza, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really exciting to see the report released and to see a bunch of people connected. Briefly, my name is Kenny. I have the privilege of co-leading Hello World, which is Ashoka's global initiative for people on the move. The initiative Hello Europe belongs to. And over the past plus 8 years, we've been applying social innovation to field of migration. And one of the keys we have seen, perhaps the central one, is the need to recognize and support change making within this field. So essentially, regardless of the circumstances that drive migration and refugee movements, which are often terrible, we have observed that there's this constant pattern of positive contribution and eagerness to contribute to the good of all on behalf of people on the move and those that receive them. A way of putting this shortly is when people are on the move, change making sprouts up, it emerges. And nowhere has this been more obvious, at least for us in Europe, than over the past few years, as we've seen a lot of people on the move coming from Ukraine and other places across Europe. When we recognize the change making of these groups, we see improvement and we see more change for good. So there's like a virtuous cycle on recognizing this change making. So I say this because I think this is kind of a central argument that we'll come back to. People on the move and communities that welcome them can be and are change makers that need support to continue to do good work for the good of all. Today we have the privilege to hear from some of the key change makers that we've discovered in this mapping. Representatives, I think we have representatives here of all the countries we've analyzed. So these are people who have engaged in creative action to solve a social problem, acquiring and applying the will and the skills to make positive change and put empathy in action for the good of all. Now, today, of course, is just a small selection of these leaders. As Misza said, we've interviewed over 365, or exactly 365. So we could make a calendar with one change maker for every day of the year. We won't do that, but if anyone wants to, it's a great idea. This is a small selection that we're interviewing today. We've made an effort, especially to bring representation from the different countries and from different sectors to the board, to the panel, to kind of show how this is hitting different sectors. Of course, many voices are missing here, but you'll find them in the paper, which we placed a link to. So enough from me. What I'm going to do next, I'm going to ask some questions. And as I ask different questions, I'll direct to some of the different panelists and introduce them as we go into those phases. I think that's an easier way to kind of remember who's speaking. So let me go ahead and get started. One of the biggest, most important things and questions that we addressed was around the self-perception of the change maker. That is whether someone feels like a change maker. And this is very important for us because in our experience in the field of social innovation and change making, we've understood that the more individuals perceive themselves as change makers, the more permission they give themselves to create change and the more impact they make. So there's a direct relationship between feeling, understanding, and seeing oneself as a change maker and the impact one creates. So we want more people to self-identify as change makers in a deeper way. And this was one of the first questions we asked. As Misza mentioned, those mapped self-identified as change makers at a 4.38 out of 5 rate, which is a very high rate, of course. Interestingly, this percentage was higher in people with lived experience of migration, as well as youth. And when they're in leadership, people with lived experience of migration, their organization as a whole benefits and the self-perception of change making increases. Another way of putting this, or another thing we're seeing, is we've also found that the harder the obstacles a person has had to face, often the stronger they identify as a change maker on the other side. So with that in mind, let me jump to, let me ask one of our panelists. First, I'll introduce her, Karina Rumiantseva. I hope I said that right. She's a Ukrainian, born in Kharkiv in Ukraine and migrated later to Hamburg, Germany. And I'm assuming you're calling in from Hamburg. She's an activist and a member of FAIN Ukraine. There she's organized protests over the last 1.5 years, and she's done significant political and educational work with different parties, organizations, and diasporas to connect Ukrainian refugees more broadly with society and to shed light on the topic of anti-Slavism. So let me ask you, Katerina, how are you activating change making in refugees that arrive? And as I ask that, some people often feel that asking people who come from difficult situations signifies putting an extra, maybe a, impossibly heavy burden on people who already have had enough problems. What are your thoughts or experience there? How do you see change making emerge?
Thank you, Kenny, for this question. I think when refugees came to Hamburg last year, I experienced very often that while I was standing and coordinating the protests, a lot of people came to me with their own ideas, their own initiatives, and were ready to do something because they arrived with nothing, expect their qualifications, and search for community in Germany, especially in Hamburg. And we have to keep in mind that their qualifications will not be recognized at the same moment, and they don't have any work directly. So we have a lot of time, and they cannot go straight on with their lives that they had to leave behind. So therefore, it's very important to this in this time when you work with these people to tell them, yes, you have potential and you're motivated, we can make a difference together. And so, for example, initiatives like Ukrainian Hugs were created in Hamburg by the Ukrainian refugee Nikita, and he was just 50 years at the time, and he set up his own initiative, which is making cultural events for collecting money for Ukraine. And also he had to flee with his mother and brother from Sumy, Ukraine in March 2022. So then I migrated to Germany, myself as a quota refugee. I know how important it is to network and simply have the opportunity to let my creativity run free and get resources for my ideas and the support, as I give Nikita at some moments because of my German skills or my networking skills. And we should never forget that this kind of work I did and Nikita did, I did it beside my full-time job, like many other volunteers did too. And so care work and the so-called work-war balance is kind of thing too. And it's very important for self-perception, I think.
Thank you, Katerina. That's super, and thank you for the examples too, because I think, especially for some of us who maybe haven't been kind of on the front line, so to speak, of welcoming, either because we live in countries that are slightly farther away or haven't welcomed as many, or we just haven't been involved. Understanding how active people are and want to be as they arrive, I think is really, really important. This change making kind of emerges. Let me direct this same question to Cila Slobogian Kurtiak. Again, I hope I had that right. She joined us from Hungary. Cila, sorry, has been supporting Ukrainian refugees and migrants fleeing to Hungary since the outbreak of the war. As a native Ukrainian and Hungarian speaker and translator, she immediately organized translation services for refugees, volunteers, and hosting organizations. And she also founded the Bona Fide Foundation to provide countrywide services, not just to the main city, including helping to solve, in addition to translation and other issues, helping to solve document issues, which I imagine is a pretty significant issue often. Additionally, she coordinates a number of organizations together to try to find systemic solutions to some of the issues emerging. Again, Cila, let me go back to this question that we were asking about change making, refugees arriving, getting them involved. How have you encouraged that and seen that happen? I imagine there's a number of stories or situations where people have been able to be engaged, but how do you feel about engaging refugees as change makers, and where are you seeing that?
Hello to everyone. I think that change making is very important in the life to refugees. For example, in our site, the staff of our charity organization is exclusively constant of refugees and migrants from Ukraine. They come, and that's why we can communicate with refugees, migrants, without any language barriers or cultural barriers. That's why they can turn to us with help sincerely, not with any thought that we can to help them because it's only our job. For example, we have a lot of mentored people. With them, we visit a lot of Ukrainian programs here in Hungary. So they also can become a part of Ukrainian team, and they, if want, can also help to other new refugees. So it's also good, not only for new refugees, but also for themselves psychologically. For example, in our organization, I came from Transcarpathian region, but also people came from Kharkiv, Kherson, Kyiv region. It's very bad situation now there. So they came to work here, and parallelly help to other people. It's very good, I think.
Thank you, Cila. And I think you've landed on something, or both of you have spoken that is really important, and we're seeing as well, right? There's to be perceived as someone just needing help and not able to contribute is something that is not good. It's not been helpful, right? And one thing from a global perspective, so I have the privilege of overseeing a lot of work around migration, both in Europe and in other continents, including like Latin America in particular, where we run Hola America. We've seen that often in Europe, our refugee programs or programs around refugees can be fairly paternalistic. They can look to people and say, oh, poor thing, let me come in, rest for 3 years, learn the language, and then eventually we'll get you to work. and that hasn't been very effective, where both of you seem to be saying, be able to get people, you know, obviously help them with the barriers to change making, but get them to contribute to others, to be able to help new people coming in, to be able to get involved. It helps also with mental health and with integration, for lack of a better word, right? That being part of society, feeling that they're contributing. And we see a lot of this more active, more quickly in other continents as well, where there may not be as much social services, let's say, in response. I was jumping into the barrier challenges we identified. I think you probably heard me say we identified a few key barriers: lack of funding, the role of authorities, mental health challenges, workforce issues, and lack of awareness, as well as prejudices and narratives. We'll talk about a few of these, but I wanted to hone in on the second one, the role of authorities. And we have the privilege today to have Jan Orlovsky with us. He's the director of the Migration Office of the Slovak Ministry of Interior. Jan came to this office in January 2021, I believe, from the leading post at the Open Societies Foundation in Slovakia. He also presides over the National Steering Committee for Migration, Inclusion, Integration of Foreigners, which is a formal platform of government and non-government actors tasked to provide recommendations for the government on the subject. Jan, you're in the midst of the insanity and of governments, non-government organizations, you know, all these different things. As you hear this, you know, in the surveys, one of the challenges is working with local governments and being on both sides. How are you seeing this? And maybe even, you know, to people in the room and to others, what can local governments do to support more change making, and what can organizations do to engage more with them?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Kenny. I mean, from the very beginning, it was obvious that none of the states was actually trained to handle the situation of that magnitude. So in my country, for example, 75% of the civil protection units were decimated, and actually people were fired in the last 15 years. So the ability of a state to react quickly and professionally to this huge number of people arriving was very limited. Therefore, the local authorities, as well as the NGOs and various charities, were absolutely essential in a sense of helping. And I think the fact that there is a lot of autonomy in human decision making was great. I was also struck by how varied were the maps you at Ashoka created. That map of Romania or Germany or Slovakia was very different. That I felt that Slovak connections were more connected. In Germany, I saw more of autonomous managing of the crisis, in a sense of, like, I think the local authorities are much more used to having the autonomy of making decisions without the central authority, or actually they were by law designed in a way that, okay, we can react to crisis on our own. In our small world of Slovakia of 5 million people, the connections are more numerous, and people like me, for example, who have experience from private sector as well as the NGO sector, are kind of like natural connectors to the various areas. So I felt that the state is here to create immediate response in a sense of legal framework, so that you need a temporary protection. Otherwise, people will have to ask for asylum, which will be a lengthy procedure. That's why, for example, Slovakia had the temporary protection status 3 days ahead of European Commission, because we had the practice of 20 years ago. We used it in Slovakia. So, and that was the essential of, like, okay, so we have them as a legal entities now, all the people who came, and now what do we do in connection? So, and obviously the cities and municipalities that who have had some experience with foreigners beforehand, because of the, you know, in major investment from abroad and a need to hire foreign workforce, were much better in addressing the crisis than smaller towns who have limited amounts of people arriving from other places. Slovakia is still one of the least populated countries in terms of foreigners. We have less than 5% of our population are foreign-born or coming from another country. Therefore, also the perception of public, how the general public reacts to the fact that foreigners are in, is really different from region to region. But people don't live with the government. People live in a local community. Therefore, it really is very different from city to city, where actually I see the crucial element in addressing the crisis rates, that someone on a municipal level understands I would say the environment of the NGO and charity sector in a city, so that that person can address immediately, oh, for housing, I have these two NGOs helping me. For healthcare, I have these guys working in, let's say, ambulances all over the place. So it has to have this one sort of like overarching figure who can, first encourage people, and second, knows the environment really well.
No, that's super helpful. Even the way you've broken it down. One thing we're seeing from all the countries involved essentially is exactly this. There's this when there's a strong grassroots kind of civil society sector and they're connected well locally, when
Yes.
larger agencies or money comes in from different places, it's a lot easier to get it to the right people, to the right situations. Whereas if that's not built as much, or
Yeah.
if the larger organizations that come in don't work with them, we're much less effective, right? So that, again, it goes back almost to this need of how do we promote, how do we keep encouraging, how do we keep lifting up local change makers that are leading some of this work on the ground, right?
Yeah, from my perspective, it was a huge lesson for the state to actually realize that without the grassroots organizations and local people like we spoke here, you're absolutely helpless. Like, you cannot reach out to various parts of your country in the city. So you have to rely on someone who is on the ground. And from the state perspective, it's just the sentence about encouraging this kind of cooperation. And once you let that go and let that happen, it really happens. But if you're like, oh, we don't care about the NGOs because we, the state, can manage everything, then of course it takes a completely different route. So I think this crisis has been a fantastic example of how the government and local government can work together with the local individuals and organizations in the field. So for me, this was fantastic experience so far.
I want to quote you on that. I just wrote it down. Without these local change makers and NGOs, the state is absolutely helpless. But it's an absolute truth that we've seen in this. Well, let me turn to Andrzej Grupa, sorry, from Ashoka, Poland. He's also here. As we know, Poland is one of the countries that has received, I think it is the country that's received the most Ukrainian refugees, and also has had a very fantastic and special response, including a lot of these local organizations. So Andrzej is responsible for conducting the interviews in Poland, and he works with our team there for Hello and on migration issues. He also works with Ashoka, supporting people from different communities, fostering collaboration and agency. He's all about bringing folks together, getting them to do stuff together. You've spoken to countless social entrepreneurs, especially this year. As you look at these challenges, as we hear from Jan, what are some of the things that come to mind, or that you've heard? What are the challenges that you feel are most urgent?
Hello, Kenny. Hello, everyone. Indeed, I had this privilege to conduct most of the interviews in Poland. Some of the issues, some of the challenges are very similar, but there are also some differences. And again, to the interviews, I must admit, many of those connections were very deep, insightful, and I must say also touching from that human perspective. But answering to your question, from those discussions, I took away some of the points which I would start first and foremost, that the voice of the migrants and the refugees is missing in the public debate. So we shall really make self-advocacy more heard. In this way, people on the move can become a subject, but not only always the object of the discussion. And that way also society can realize how capable and skilled those people in the move are. And it can also help to counterbalance the attempts we sometimes can see to discredit them. Beside the narratives, The second thing I would say, that the narratives are more hurtful. We need media as a partner to play a role also in that process, that we need more positive narratives showing the determination, entrepreneurship, agency. And also I heard many times from them, come on, we are paying taxes, we are contributing to the society, we are contributing to the economy. Let's start to put that issue also on the table. So other thing, probably is not only Polish thing. We need a stability of and transparency of legal regulations regarding the possibility of legal residence in Poland. Many say that it's easier to set up a company than to legalize residence. And as you can imagine, it's crucial for individuals to have this elementary sense of security. And finally, we do need more safe space for the integration to happen. That also was as a refrain, coming back and back. We need places that people can mingle, chat, meet, talk, ask questions, and feel accepted. Luckily, we have such places. Great example of that is, for example, a regional cooperation that we can see in Lublin. It's a town on the eastern part of Poland, less than 100 kilometers from Ukrainian border, another 100 from the Belarusian border. So we can observe the collaboration of NGOs, municipality, academia, people from business, regional officials too. There is also a Ashoka fellow involved there, which is very positive, that some solutions they offer on the systemic level are implemented on the national scale too. So, but there's a very spectacular example. What they are doing is they managed to open a Baobab Center. We mentioned that in our report. It's a community center, we can say, in the space of former bank. So it's rearranged. It's very nice. It's a very comfortable place, and we can say that they invest there the most valuable currency, time, to build last long relations, bonds between people. That's a great example how it shall work, that people can get a multi-level help there, that when adults are getting some legal or psychological help, minors can either use the computer to write an email or important letter to some relatives abroad, but they can also at the same time play on the playground or take part of some workshops. There are regular workshops also offered there. So what we see, it's what is very important in that it's consistent. So that also can really help to build this last long bonds or relationships. There are also other places, such in Tri-City, which is a place connected to the seaside, which historically is the most open place in Poland for incoming people, but also a harbor that many generations of Poles through that harbor left the country on the period of immigration. And in such a city, RC Foundation, we also mentioned that in the report, they quickly enable spontaneous collections of goods, grassroots activities to move from private houses to the space of municipal cultural institutions, cooking workshops, handicrafts, language learning. This allow again that activities to be continuing, inclusive, and it's ongoing still. So that I would say the important and impressive bits out of what you said. Generally, a positive view of what Polish people did. Of course, that was a huge movement to welcome, to host people, but not always, not everywhere. No.
Yeah. No, I just want to pull two things you've said that I think are really important. and have come up a lot in the survey. One is, as you rightly stressed, we need more stories about how migrants themselves are collaborating, right? And that's one of the things we're bringing up here. It's not a one-sided deal, you know, where people, welcome people, and now they haven't. No, it's there's a collaboration. And in fact, one of the things that made Polish response so powerful was strong diaspora communities of Ukrainians and other refugees that were already active, right? And then the second thing you mentioned, just again to bring up, is this need for these mingling spaces, right? For spaces for people to connect, both at an individual level, to just, as we say in English, like rub shoulders, right? Run into people, talk, be forced to sit down and have coffee or tea and understand that there's a person in front of you. But also you mentioned, and Jan mentioned this as well, and a few others, the need to connect organizations, right? To have places where different kinds of organizations and governments can speak. I know we're getting close to being short on time. We're gonna get there. I'm gonna go into the next topic, which is emerging opportunities. And again, there were, as good change makers, you know, everyone we interviewed had tons of ideas of what are the opportunities. That's one of the things we see change makers do, is where others see problems, change makers see opportunities. Some ideas emerged, including 2/3 thought that a strong community was an opportunity. 1/2 of the people, a sense of urgency. There's untapped future potential for people on the move. Goodwill, right, for refugees from the majority was still pretty much there. Positive narratives. And when I speak, there was a general rule of thumb, which is what I mentioned from Anje, which is a need to involve, or an opportunity to involve and connect all actors in this and larger opportunities. People saw that as, if everyone's still interested, let's get them together. So let me direct a question around this to Ivana. We have 2 more panelists that we're going to get to. Ivana Stenikova, I think I said that right. Shenikova. There you did it right. Ivana works for the Endusmena Foundation in the Czech Republic, which was founded by an Ashoka fellow. And Endusmena serves as donor coordinator in the field of education and integration of Ukrainian refugee children. They coordinate foundations and donors to bring targeted and effective aid in the integration process of Ukrainian children and youth in Czechia. They also partner up with other foundations and nonprofit organizations, policymakers, research agencies, etc., to kind of shine the light on gaps and places where potential solutions can emerge. In your interview, Ivana, you said the situation of the education of Ukrainian children revealed several gaps in the Czech educational system that now can be openly addressed, such as support for all disadvantaged children. And I want to hone in on this, because one thing we often see is migrants don't, or people on the move don't create problems, but because it's a large movement of people, often it enables shining light on problems that already existed, right? And it sounds like that's what you're speaking of. I'd love for you to speak a bit about this. How has the arrival of people on the move enabled you to push for changes that were needed before? And what are some of these opportunities that are emerging in connection to the challenges, right, with these refugee movements in Czechia and other places you're active in?
Thanks so much for the question. Definitely the big movement of Ukrainian migrants here put much more attention to these things. Just for example, like school capacities in the big cities, that was here long time before, like for the as a problem here. And just right after the war started, like you already introduced us, the many private foundations got together, like, yeah, we really want to do something about it. It was the private foundations which are already very well known here, not only in the field of education, but they put together like, yeah, we want to do something, but like there is so many things we need to do, not only in the education field, but also like different fields, how to help immediately. So they create a group. So after some time, we settled as a coordinator of the group. So just to explain a little bit more, and we started coordination. We start to map and to connect also with municipalities, also with ministries of mostly education, to know who is doing what. So to map who is doing what in the education field. and what is also the public sector refugee team, because also like the Czechia was one of the country with the most refugees per capita. And so there was settled also the UNICEF big refugee team. So we connected with them.
Więc UNICEF miał tutaj
Organizations in the terrain, so we could map also the situation in the terrain. And the goal of all this was to be more effective with the foundations money, and also, like we were saying, to pointing out the light and looking also for the systemic solutions. So so like this, like the unique platform was settled up. And just for one example, as we were meeting up once a month, and we were discussing.
Spotykaliśmy się raz w miesiącu.
So as one example, for the theme of non-formal education, like extracurricular activities, 4 foundations got together in the beginning, and we were partnering with the Czech Council for Children and Youth, and they started to administer the voucher system, which in Czech called Darujeme kroužky dětem, like the big system where not only Ukrainian families, but also Czech families could ask for financial help for support for the extracurricular activities, like sport activities and different types of activities which could help with integration of the children. And also this was settled up as a pilot last year, and it should serve also for the whole Czech Republic, and it should serve also as like systematic solution, or like bigger scale solution. For the opportunities, now it is definitely the shift from like the urgent help to integration. From our coordination point, it's definitely the deeper partnership and cooperation between all sectors, and which could bring like synergies and many systematic solutions. And in the field of education, we really feel the big opportunity in better inclusion, because also from the researches in school, it shows that many teachers feel that the integration means assimilation of the children, that like everybody should behave the same. So just to finish my idea, that the researches shows that's more as assimilation and not as inclusion, or how can I say it? So we see this as a big opportunity for the change of mindset of the teachers, to be more welcome of otherness, to be more inclusive, and that means that they would need more or better competencies to strengthen their competencies, how to work with heterogeneous group. This a lot of things has been done recently, for example, for Meta organization here in Czech Republic. And one example which I would finish it is also like you were saying a lot about also mental health issues. So one of the nice example could be Edusmena in the Kutnohorsko region. They set up the mobile team for the mental health. So it's set up with different professions, including also Ukrainian psychologists. And they could help in different schools. So this is some of the idea which could lead to bigger scale.
Ivana, thank you so much. And just as I was hearing you speak, you know, I coming from a very different context, right? And like I live in Spain, and I work with fellows all across Europe, and some of the challenges you're mentioning are challenges in every single country with different groups of people, whether they're migrants or others. You know, some of like redefining what integration means, or diversifying the way your classroom works so that different learning styles. Some of these things that I think for innovative educators are pretty basic, but for so many others they're not. You know, and it makes me, on the one hand, slightly excited of saying, wow, an opportunity of people on the move arriving to kind of inject innovation into education is so important, so interesting. And it makes me wonder too, you know, is there an opportunity to bring some of those learnings to other places? So I think it's something we can explore more later, but I'd love to just, I wanted to plant that in people's heads. I'm gonna move on because I know we're reaching time, and there's one last panelist that we haven't reached yet, and it's not because we didn't want her in first or anything, it's because she's actually 9 hours behind us today, so it's an ungodly hour. This is Ioana Bauer from Romania, but who is currently somewhere, I imagine, on the west coast of the United States or something very far away. So she woke up super early for us. I wanted to thank her for that, but we said we'll let the coffee kick in and ask you later. Let me introduce you briefly. Ioana Bauer is an Ashoka Fellow from Romania. From her organization Eliberare, she is creating a social movement against modern slavery and sexual exploitation in Romania. For this, they develop prevention activities, awareness raising materials on the issue, and build capacity with organizations across the country. And they also work directly with survivors in destination countries. Ioana is also working on a macro level, seeking to influence public policy, advocating for rights of victims, building better legislative framework for protection and prosecution, and also for proactive identification. In other words, doing a lot of work, especially around this topic of people trafficking and exploitation. Thank you so much for joining us from the US. Let me mention something as I and ask a question. One thing I know that you've developed over the past few years is the Compass model, which was created with Ukrainian colleagues who joined the Eliberare team in April 2022. And I'm quoting you in the mapping, as you said, going through the experience of leaving everything behind and fleeing the country in search of safety. This was an experience that was super helpful to build the Compass model based on the lived experiences of some of these colleagues from Ukraine. And the purpose of this model is to increase awareness of safety measures, develop individual safety plans for those at risk, and provide assistance to them. So I'd love for you to describe just a bit of what that is and what you're doing, but also how does this happen? You know, as we've talked about migrants arriving and bringing new light on problems, but also just bringing new solutions and new ways of thinking. What are some of the novelties or differences that you've seen emerge in your organization by involving people on the move?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kenny. And just hearing all of the change makers before me and the results of the mapping, I think I am extremely encouraged, even though it's an ungodly hour here. Just realizing the force that was put behind the effort and how many structural changes can come from these efforts. Kenny, I think a lot of times we look at the people on the move and the populations that come, whether refugees or migrating from other reasons, as people who bring problems, but actually what ends up happening is that they're highlighting gaps that are already existing, right? And that's something that we saw. So in Romania, we had this huge wave that came in, and they didn't cause the issues in our protection system, in our medical system. It just was a reminder that a lot of times those gaps can be overlooked, or people can get very used to not having very basic services that have to do with
дуже часто люди так насправді звикли до того, що вони не мають до
etwas tun.
We are not a humanitarian organization. We are
Nosotros no somos una organización humanitaria, sino que somos una.
We actually respond, but without repeating what happened, for example, in the lockdown, when every organization, regardless of their specificity, was giving out masks, for example, right? We said we are not gonna go ahead and change who we are. We need to stay true to our mission. Now, there were a few opportunities that arose, and at first, they very much looked at challenges. So in the first few days, everybody was talking about human trafficking, and they were doing that in a way that was very sensationalized. we actually had a case of a pregnant woman who was afraid to cross the border into Romania because everything that she was reading on the Telegram channel and everywhere else was, you know, you're going to cross in and traffickers are going to snatch you at the border. And if, you know, traffickers would sit around in white vans that said free candy on them, it would be very easy to spot them, catch them, and move forward. But that doesn't look like that. So one of the things that we realized was that we needed to give everyone actionable information and from a safety perspective. So what does it actually look like to understand that human trafficking does exist? It is a risk, but there are these resources, there are these measures that you can take in order to stay safe. And that's where involving our experts by experience, which were our colleagues who joined us, was extremely, extremely important. From the fact that everybody was doing leaflets and posters, but actually the communication within the refugee and the migrant community was happening on Telegram, to what are the things that people were interested in, right? What were refugees searching for? What were the things that were important to them? Because most people who are vulnerable to human trafficking, they're not going to read a report. They're not going to ask, what is human trafficking, and go through, you know, technical literature. So what we ended up doing with our Ukrainian colleagues was that we used analytics to figure out what Ukrainians who are coming into Romania were interested in, and we inserted safety information within those topics. And all this was being done by our Ukrainian colleagues through the platforms that Ukrainians were already native in. So this was a learning experience of actually listening to the people, understanding their needs, understanding what they are actually searching for, and then using those avenues for education. I think another piece was another opportunity that is still there, by the way. So if you want to join us, the opportunity is still there, was to educate the humanitarian sector, because we heard everything about the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. And what we realized was that what that actually meant was having this policy that looks really, really nice, that actually looks at minimizing the liability of the organization that was donating or being involved in the country without necessarily knowing the context. But it looked very little at what does exploitation actually look like, how can we prioritize preventing it and detecting it, and what are the clear resources that need to be put in order to back up that wonderful policy that looks perfect in a folder, or as a box to be checked. And I think this is something that we're continuing to see. You know, we pride ourselves for being able to involve experts by experience, and I kept hearing the lack of funding. I think a lot of times it's not lack of funding, it's a lack of understanding of the donors, of what actually needs to be funded. We are seeing a lot of people pulling out, for a lot of donors, a lot of organizations pulling out from neighboring countries without actually realizing that these experts by experience that were hired within the effort, so on and so forth, are now at risk at losing their livelihood, and basically their path to reintegration. So with this, the opportunity remains, and I think it's very important to keep the conversation going. So thank you so much, Ashoka, for continuing to map, continuing to look at existing resources and existing challenges. And I think together, just looking at the collaboration and coordination piece, we can continue to bring about change in that.
Thank you so much, Ioana. I mean, I feel like I want to stop with each one of you and listen for like an hour to what you're saying, because there's so many insights emerging. I know we're kind of tight on time, so here's what I'm going to do. There's one question that I'm going to bring in at the end if we have time, but before that, I want to ask a question to each panelist. I'm going to read the recommendations that we made really quickly, but I want you to prepare the answer to this question, a 1 or 2 sentence answer for each of you panelists. after I read this, which is if you had a magic wand, you know, like a Harry Potter kind of one, and you were able to change one thing, kind of in the sector, in the response, or in the funding, or in, you know, in the issue going forward to make Europe better, what would it be? Right. So I'll read the recommendations. It may inspire you, or you may choose something else, but just think of that magic wand. And if you could think just in a sentence or two, we'll kind of wrap around there. Before then, and Misza, if you could put the slides up for this would be great. We, you know, from the paper, and based on our experience as well, working with social entrepreneurs, we came up with 5, I think they're 5. Yeah, 5 recommendations. There we go. And I'll just read these two because a lot of them sort of come up in the conversations. But these are sort of important as we look forward. You know, how do we increase change making across Europe, both for refugees and others? First, we see there's a need for more leadership from underrepresented communities, such as those with migrant background, women, and youth. As we saw, these leaders bring in valuable insights and resourcefulness, but they often face additional barriers, including funding challenges and isolation. Therefore, there needs to be an intentional attempt and work to support these leaders through dedicated funding mechanisms, diversity checks and organizational leadership structures, etc. Second one, right below that, is new resources are required urgently. And like Joanna said, it's not just about more money, it's about understanding where and how that money can be applied, or the different resources. In particular, we see with a lot of change makers that are starting organizations from scratch, etc., accessing big funding or accessing quick funding is very difficult, and it requires building a lot of capacity. Can we come up with quicker ways to fund small initiatives and medium-sized initiatives? This is very important going forward. The third, there must be more connection spaces to foster significant personal and professional connections between change makers and the communities they work in. This involves both networking and co-creation opportunities, as well as just deeper connections to overcome feelings of isolation. Particularly for the change makers themselves, often isolation or feeling alone is one of the factors that leads to burnout when you're leading a social organization. How can we get people together in calls like this where they hear from each other and identify ways to work together? Fourth, the narrative surrounding migration need to change to focus more on contributions and hope rather than pity or compassion. This involves building empathy, countering propaganda, and celebrating success. Migrants need to be seen as the change makers they are. Again, we've spoken quite a bit about this. And the last piece, of course, the report will end with this. Organizations need to intentionally activate more change makers. I mean, the problems, the challenges, the movement, it's not going away. The only way we can counter problems is with creating more solutions and more quickly. We believe this is one of the main things that many of these organizations should start doing and thinking about, is in addition to solving this relief program, problem, etc., how do I activate more change makers? Okay, I'll stop there. And now let me go to our panelists. We have exactly 10 minutes. And there's some crazy people outside here yelling, sorry about that. But let me go one by one in the same order we started. And again, the question was, if you had a magic wand, what would be one thing you would change? Katerina, let's start with you.
I think the fourth goes with me because I think the narrative surrounding migration need to change, especially in Germany, because we have a big problem with right-winged parties, political parties, which are spreading propaganda and saying that migration is bad and we should shut down Germany and so on. And this is, I think, one of the most problem, because with this problem goes the less budget for structures which is needed for migration and the people which are arriving here and want to work and want to make a change and so on.
Yes, thank you, Katerina. Tila, you're next. What's the one thing you would change? You're muted. Let's do.
Okay.
There you go.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I think that we need more and more often communication with each other. Not as in earlier, but now some more programs between structures and funds, organizations.
Absolutely. Again, this connection theme, right? We've talked a bit about the narrative, the connection theme. Jan, what would you change with your magic wand?
From my perspective, the number one would be include refugees into the social and healthcare educational systems right away, instead of creating separate system for you guys coming in as guests and temporary protected people. I think the Polish and Czech example, which I know more or less better than any other, was exactly the right way to go about this, so that people don't have to feel like we are separate from the nation here, so that inclusion process can start much faster on also administrative level.
Yeah, and I imagine it leads to quicker contribution too, because I know one of the issues.
I mean the work. I mean the people
not regularizing migration is a lack of taxes.
Yeah, exactly. People could start working right away, but in terms of healthcare, it created a lot of problem in already overburdened healthcare system. So we created basically a separate administrative issue for all the doctors and nurses. It was a mess.
It's great. Andrzej.
Yes, it's me. With my answer, I would go back to like previous century where people speaking Jewish and Jewish people speaking Yiddish and Hebrew use the expression of Polin about Poland, a place of which means Poland. Polin means Poland, but also a place you can rest. So I would spread that to the whole region. Let's make that region a place that people who struggle, who have so much tension now, experience so many difficulties on their way, a place to have rest and re-establish themselves and find their place on earth here. So when I use the magic wand, I use it for a real reason. So let's do it that way in the whole region, not only Poland.
Thank you. Yeah, and to be proud of that definition, right, of being the resting place. I love that. Ivana, what would you do?
So I wouldn't repeat the things which has been said here, because I agree with most of it. I would say just from the point of whole population to stop judgments and stop being afraid, and to end up with the things I was saying about, like, be more welcome to otherness and to differentness.
Thank you. And Joanna, last but not least.
Yeah, I'm going to see the recommendations or the fixes as compound ones. So I'm not going to repeat, but I think what I would do is I would make the unsexy financing requests or funding requests sexy, specifically going back to the education, where we understand that we need advocacy, where we understand that we need to think long term, where we understand that we need foresight, which means that it's not always going to be those key words that every funder wants to see in the emergency responses or the whatever the things are right now that we need to put into every application, but think long term and figure out how to change the perception, and maybe also take out the colonialistic approach when it comes to funding such responses.
That's brilliant. Make getting funding sexy again, or something like that, if we could summarize. Before we end, we have one more minute, and one question came in. I'd love to throw that out if there's one or two people who want to answer it shortly. It's a complex question, right? But Ranak Patel asks, psychologically, how are some people able to take something traumatic and move into action versus going into hyper stress states like shutting down or mental breakdowns? And I know quite a few of you have worked with kind of that building resilience. Just wondering if there's one or two answers, or even pointing to materials or something, because I know this is a big topic. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ella. But I was wondering, any of you, but I was thinking particularly of Katerina or Tila or Ioana, as you work with people kind of building that resilience, is there one or two things you would say? Feel free to.
I think I need 1 more minute to think about it. Maybe someone else.
I dropped a link in the chat. I hope you can see it, and it can be accessed. So you'll go to a page that's in Romanian, but you can access an English version and I believe a Spanish version as well. This is from the pandemic, but it specifically talks about how do you build a self-care plan? What are some resources that you can put in place from boundaries? What are things that you can do in order to disconnect, so on and so forth. So this would be one resource that hopefully everybody can take back, adapt, obviously, to this context. And then the other piece, what worked for us was that we understood that as leaders of the organization, we have a huge responsibility to actually put in place mechanisms of external supervision and support for everyone, including our Ukrainian colleagues, or especially for our Ukrainian colleagues, understanding what's going on and figuring out how to walk through the process, and it's going to look differently. So for example, if for our Romanian staff, we wouldn't offer professional counseling or support in figuring out what's your next step as far as your career goes, we very much wanted to do that for the people who joined our team from Ukraine, understanding that we might be fortunate enough to have them for a season, but it might not be that this is going to be their place forever. So how do we help them in their transition and invest in them?
Thank you so much, Joanna. I know we're right on time. I'm going to hand over to Ella, and just before to say this question of going from trauma to resilience or trauma to change making, I think could be a next topic that we raise, because it's something we're seeing, and we're seeing it's a skill that a lot of you in this room and other change makers are doing. It may be something worth spending time on. So be attentive to that. I think we'll pick it up at some point. Ella, take us home.
Kenny, thank you for taking us through the discussion. It's so many insights that it's very difficult to close. But I, at this point, really want to thank each and every one of you for being present with us. We really dived into what are the challenges and opportunities that we see for migration and change making in Europe. But it doesn't end with this event. And we really hope that you take the inspiration and knowledge in the report and in this conversation and turn it into action. With Hello Europe, we are now searching for more change makers in this field. We are aiming to build more collaborative spaces and really focusing on migration narratives and how we can reshape them. All this work is being driven by the team and by all of you. And I would just close with, if you want to continue this conversation, please reach out to me, Kenny, or anyone in the team. Please share your thoughts and feedback in the survey that I believe Ovidio is now sharing in the chat. You have the report available, and thank you again for being with us.